Today, I'll talk to you about the NOVA food classification system, and also I'll explain why ultra-processed foods are bad for us. I'll start with the rationale for NOVA, why NOVA was developed. Then I'll describe it briefly, some of its uses and applications, and some developments and improvements. So first, the rationale. Why in the 21st century we need a food classification system focused on food processing? There are at least three reasons. The first reason, and obvious, is that the content of critical nutrients in foods and diets today is largely driven by food processing. By critical nutrients, I mean sodium, free sugars, saturated fat, trans fat, etc. But a second important reason is that it's not only nutrients in a food that influence health. There are other attributes, and these other attributes are also influenced by food processing today. For examples, first, the food matrix. By food matrix, I mean the physical and chemical interactions between food components. And these interactions that modern nutrition science is shown today, that these interactions are very important to explain health and disease. And of course, food matrix can be affected by food processing. A second attribute in foods that are not nutrients, but also important for health, are non-nutrient health protective food components. So food has, for instance, antioxidants that are officially not nutrients, and they can, of course, influence health, and of course, they can be influenced, they can be modified by food processing. A third important attribute in foods nowadays is the presence of xenobiotics. Xenobiotics are chemical compounds that do not belong to foods. They were introduced there, and very often they are introduced by food processing. An example here is additives. Finally, texture, palatability, thermic effects, satiety, all these other attributes, they are very important to determine our capacity to regulate energy balance. And therefore, they are very important in the development of obesity, for instance. And finally, eating patterns, the way we eat, how, when, where, all these can influence health and disease, and also can be influenced by food processing. The fact that food processing has to be considered in the definition of healthiness of foods and diets have been increasingly recognized worldwide. An example is this report from FAO, WHO from last year, with guiding principles on how to define sustainable healthy diets. The second principle in this report states that healthy diets are based on a variety of unprocessed or minimally processed foods, while restricting highly processed foods. But the point is, what are minimally processed foods? What is the definition of minimally processed food? What's the definition of highly processed foods? That's the reason we developed NOVA in 2009. We felt that these terms were not defined, and then we start to define these terms in a commentary in 2009. This was the early version of NOVA. So these ideas were implemented, adapted, evolved, and in 2017, we have NOVA in its final form. Let's describe NOVA. So, but first, let's see how NOVA defines food processing, how we understand food processing. Well, we define food processing in a very simple way. Food processing is any method used to turn fresh foods into food products. This definition was accepted widely. This, for instance, is a text from EUFIC, who is a food institute funded by the food industry in Europe. And they go beyond this. They say food processing involve one or more combination of various processes, including washing, chopping, fermenting, packaging. Packaging makes part of food processing. This is recognized here. And more important, food processing also includes adding ingredients to food. For example, to extend shelf life, for example, additives. So as we see here, the inclusion of ingredients in foods, in food products, belongs to food processing. Some critics of NOVA, they say, NOVA is heavily based on the list of ingredients. Yes, it's true. But the ingredients, the choice of ingredients in a product is part of food processing, and this is recognized here. So where food processing lies in the food system? Food processing lies between agriculture and the kitchen, or between agriculture and the consumer, in the case that food products are ready to consume. So every food is produced by agriculture. What industry does is to modify foods into food products. And these food products, as I said, can go to the kitchen to prepare foods, or they can be eaten by consumers. Just a few foods are not processed before being prepared or being consumed by consumers, like vegetables or fruits. So a definition, a classification of foods that divides foods into processed and unprocessed makes no sense, because most food are processed in some way. But foods can be processed in different ways and with different purpose, which is very important for NOVA. For instance, rice can be dry and packaged, milk can be pasteurized and packaged. From milk, you can extract butter, you can extract olive oil from olives, you can turn wheat grains into bread or milk into cheese. All of these are processed foods in a way. These three groups, these examples of these three groups, they make the three first NOVA food groups. NOVA has 4 food groups. The first one is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Unprocessed foods are, of course, edible parts of plants and animals just after being separated from nature. And minimally processed foods are those unprocessed food that goes to some industrial process. They are modified essentially to prolong duration of foods. But what's important for group 1 is that no substances are added here. So the prolongation of duration of foods here is made without the use of sugar or salt or oil, anything. The second food group in NOVA is processed culinary ingredients. Here we have substances that are extracted from group 1 foods, like butter, like oil, like sugar, or like salt that are extracted from nature. But what's very important here is the purpose. So the food industry makes these products essentially to prepare, cook, and season group 1 foods. So you don't consume processed culinary ingredients, and this makes them very important. Actually, without them, it's very difficult to consume group 1 foods. So they are very important. The third group of NOVA is processed food. So processed foods are group 1 foods that are modified by the industry, in this case, with the addition of salt, sugar, oils, or fats. And the purpose here is to preserve foods and also to enhance their sensory qualities, like in the case of bread and cheese. What are the processes involved with these 3 food groups? Process that, in theory, we could do at our kitchens. Removal of non-edible, undesired parts, drying, chilling, freezing, pasteurization, fermentation, milling, pressing, centrifuging, salting, sugaring, baking. So these are traditional processes done by the industry, but essentially could be done even in the kitchens. These three food groups are very important, and they are actually the basis of traditional diets. The Mediterranean diet, for instance, but not just the Mediterranean diet, different dietary patterns we find all over the world. And why they are important? Because with these types of food processing, we increase food duration. This is essential. We won't have human societies without food processing, without prolonged duration of foods. But they are also important to make easier or more diverse food preparation, and also to enhance food sensory properties. But there are other purposes. In nowadays, we have other purposes of processing foods. And the fourth purpose is the one that is defined in ultra-processed foods. Food processing to make convenient, ready to eat or heat, and perishable, tasteful, low cost, meaning highly profitable products that are liable to replace all other foods. And this is maybe the most important feature of ultra-processed foods. They are manufactured to replace all other foods. So in theory, you could have a diet with 100% of calories from ultra-processed foods. And if you go into the market today in Israel, in any country in the world, for each group 1, group 2, group 3, for each freshly prepared dishes and meals, you find one ultra-processed alternative. And what are the processes involved with ultra-processing? A sequence of process. That's why we gave this name, ultra-processed foods, because food is processed several times before arriving to the final product. Everything starts with extraction of macronutrients from foods, extraction of oils, fats, sugars, starches, protein, contained in natural food matrices. These substances are then modified chemically, for instance, by hydrogenation of oils. And this is done essentially to prolong duration of these ingredients. A third step is the assemblage of unmodified and modified food substances. And here, many industrial processes, things that you can do at your kitchen, are used, like extrusion and deep frying. A fourth step is very important because this assemblage of proteins, carbs, lipids, they are not palatable. They are even not edible sometimes. So they are turned edible, palatable, or even hyperpalatable with the use of cosmetic additives. So the flavors in these products, the colors, the texture is given by cosmetic additives. Without the industry of cosmetic additives, the modern industry of cosmetic additives, we won't have ultra-processed foods. Finally, everything is finished with sophisticated packaging, often using synthetic materials. These products, they last long, 1, 2, 3 years. And the fact that they are packaged in this way is also important for health. So here, a formal definition of ultra-processed foods. They are industrial formulations. They are not foods. They are formulation of ingredients. These ingredients include original or chemically modified food substances that are obtained with a fractioning of whole foods and with additives that are used to make the final product palatable or hyperpalatable. The aim here, as I said, is to make convenient, tasteful, low-cost products liable to replace all other novel food groups. Although the classification of ultra-processed food is not simple, I recognize it's not simple, NOVA provides ultra-processed food markers. So a practical way to identify NOVA is to look for 2 types of substances. First, food substances that are never rarely used in kitchens, like protein isolates or gluten or casein or whey protein, and cosmetic additives. So any class of cosmetic additives, flavor enhancer, colors, emulsifiers, etc. The Brazilian dietary guidelines use this for the first time. So if you want to have an idea about the product, if it's ultra-processed or not, look for these 2 groups of ultra-processed food markers. Another important feature of ultra-processed food is the fact that their market is controlled by powerful transnational corporations. So these 10 companies, for instance, that produce ultra-processed food all over the world, the sales of these companies per day amount to more than $1 billion. And why this is important? Because this makes clear the power of this industry that produce ultra-processed food to make their products be consumed by consumers. So that's a very important feature of ultra-processed food, is that their consumption is very different from country to country. Here you see a list of 80 countries where we see not consumption, but sales of ultra-processed foods, kilograms per capita per year. So you see the United States, an average American consumes more than almost 1 kilogram of ultra-processed food per day. In India, 6 kilos. So the difference is huge. Israel is an intermediate situation, like Brazil, 165 kilos. And what the transnational corporations are doing, as any private company, so what they are doing is try to make the figures we have in the United States present in any other country. So then they have very powerful strategies to achieve this. And they have been very successful. Look, this is a recent paper on trends in sales of ultra-processed food from 2006 to 2019. So you can see that in every world regions, you have an increasing in the sales of these products. Of course, the consumption is higher in the US, in Western Europe, but everywhere the sales are increasing. And look this graphic. Here you have the amount of sales of per capita ultra-processed foods. So you see here Israel with about in the middle of the distribution. And this is compared with the annual growth of the sales. So you see that in these countries that are in the left part of the slide, the present sales are very low, but the increase could amount to almost 8% like in India. So Israel was an intermediate situation and the increase is about 2% per year. So every year there's an increase in 2%. So how Nova has been used in different situations. I'll give you some examples. So the first is on describing food processing based dietary patterns. A second uses the assessment of the effect of food processing based dietary patterns on diet quality and health and disease, development of dietary recommendation, policy and program goals and regulations. The most important use of NOVA is in studies, in scientific papers. Here you see that now we have more than 500 papers indexed in PubMed that use the term ultra-processed food. So it's just one paper in 2009, now have more than 200. To have an idea about the dynamism of this production of papers using ultra-processed foods and NOVA, here I put the same graphic for papers with the term glycemic index. Glycemic index was proposed in early 80s. It took 20 years actually to be utilized in the scientific literature. And then you have the trends very similar to what we see for ultra-processed foods. Well, as I said, the first is to describe food processing based dietary patterns. Here you see, for instance, an example of the national diet in Portugal compared with the national diet in UK using 24-hour dietary recalls. You can see that most of calories in the Portuguese diet comes from group 1 and group 2 in NOVA. While in the UK, most energy already comes from ultra-processed foods. A similar situation exists between Brazil and the United States. In each of these countries, you can divide the population into quintiles and then contrast people with a lower consumption of ultra-processed food and higher. For instance, here in the US, you see that 20% of Americans that consume less ultra-processed foods, they have a dietary pattern which is not so different from the Brazilian dietary pattern, the average Brazilian dietary patterns. And here you see that the 20% highest consumers, they have 80% of their energy from ultra-processed food. So the following examples I'll show you contrast these quintiles, so people that consume less and more in each country. This second use of NOVA, which is the effect on diet quality, the findings were summarized recently in a FAO publication from 2019. So if you want, you can go to the publication to see. But essentially, what these studies, they show that in more than 15 countries, and would love to include Israel here in this list of countries, then you know that you have an excellent national dietary survey, and they also classify foods according to NOVA. But in any case, in all these studies, they compare, the authors compare the lowest consumers of ultra-processed food, the lower quintile, with a higher quintile. And the result was the same in every country. So the more ultra-processed food is added to the overall diet, the higher the energy density, the higher the content in sugar and unhealthy fats, and the lower the content in fiber and protein. So I would say this is the perfect recipe for chronic diseases. Just an example with fiber, for instance, here. So in all these countries, in the 7 countries, you see the content in fiber of the overall diet across quintiles of ultra-processed food. So you see that in all countries, the more ultra-processed food, the lower the content of fiber. Here for energy density, I would say here that the dietary share of ultra-processed food is practically a proxy of energy density. But it's not just nutrients. Ultra-processed foods influence other attributes of diet. I don't have time here to go into detail, but here I'm putting 7 possible mechanisms that link ultra-processed foods to disease without being through nutrients. First, evidence of the reduced presence of bioactive non-nutrient compounds, in this case, phytoestrogens, increased presence of xenobiotics, not just additives, but also new formed substances, substances released by packaging materials, low satiety, low thermic effect. This is also very important to control energy balance, hyperpalatable diets and compulsive overeating, and finally, pro-inflammatory microbiome. This is a very important topic in research. So it looks that several components of ultra-processed foods can influence the microbiome in a very negative way. Based on all these mechanisms, nutrient and non-nutrient mechanisms, we would expect an effect on disease, particularly on non-communicable disease. And this is the reality. To save time, I'm referring here to 7 systematic reviews published in 2020 on ultra-processed food and health outcomes. Most of them based on cohort studies, huge cohort studies that takes 8, 10 years, 30,000, 50,000, 100,000 people followed for 8, 10 years. And what these studies, they show is that people with higher consumption of ultra-processed foods, they have higher risk of obesity, diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular diseases, breast cancer, depression, and all-cause mortality. At least these outcomes, you have 3, 4, 5 studies. One of these studies, the systematic reviews, did a meta-analysis. So it calculates summary risk for different health outcomes. So you see here for all-cause mortality, there are 5 studies, 5 cohort studies, and the summary risk is 25%, meaning that people with higher consumption of ultra-processed food in different countries, in different settings, they have 25% higher risk of dying earlier. The same for CVD, for cerebrovascular disease, depression, overweight, and obesity. It's curious that just 2 studies when this meta-analysis was done. But look, after this was 2 months ago, this meta-analysis was published by a group in Italy. After the meta-analysis, we see 3 other new system studies on ultra-processed foods and obesity, cohort studies in UK, France, and Spain, all of them showing association. So now there are 5 cohort studies linking ultra-processed foods to obesity. And as you know, there's a already famous randomized control trial done at the National Health Institutes in the US by Kevin Hall. What Kevin Hall did was to put 20 people in a hospital for 4 weeks. So 10 of these people went to a diet with 0 ultra-processed foods, and 10 people went to a diet with about 80% of energy from ultra-processed foods. After 2 weeks, they changed, so it was a crossover design. What was the main finding? The main finding was that when a person was in an ultra-processed diet, that same person, when changed to a non-ultra-processed diet, the difference was 500 kilocalories. So eating ultra-processed foods for these people was equivalent to consume 500 kilocalories more. This is huge. 2 weeks in the ultra-processed diet, people got 1 kilogram, about 1 kilogram. And they lost, the same people lost 1 kilogram. So it's a very elegant design showing causality between ultra-processed food and energy intake and weight gain. As you know, NOVA has been used for development of dietary recommendation. Brazil was the first country to adopt NOVA as a framework for dietary recommendation. Other 4 countries, most recent was Israel, used NOVA to organize recommendation around healthy diets. The Brazilian dietary guidance, as the Israel dietary guidance, is much more than food processing. So there are many recommendations, very important. But there's one chapter in Brazil and in the other guidelines about choosing food. And here is where food processing is key, considering food processing. In Brazil, the Brazilian dietary guidelines has 4 basic recommendations. So the first is to make, for NOVA food group 1, the basis of the diet. Of course, in great variety, most of plant origin, etc., etc. The second recommendation is about processed culinary ingredients. They are not forbidden, of course not, they are necessary, but they should not be used in big amounts. So they should be used in small amounts. And why they need to be used? Because most of group 1 foods need to be cooked, to be seasoned before being consumed. Processed food is also part of healthy diets, and they are very important, particularly to diversify the diet, and that if they are consumed in dishes and meals based on group 1 foods, they are perfectly okay. Which is not okay is to consume ultra-processed foods. And the reasons for that is not just health. I mean, I won't have the time now to explore this, but ultra-processed food is also important because they damage culture. They replace traditional foods and traditional recipes. And you know, we know that this makes part of our culture. The social life, I mean, eating together, and the environment. The amount of plastics that you throw into the environment is enormous when you consume ultra-processed food, for instance. Biodiversity is reduced tremendously with ultra-processed food because they are based in 3 or 4 only foods. So different reasons explain why they are important to avoid. Policy and program goals and regulations is another space of use of NOVA. Here I'm showing 3 examples. The school meal program in Brazil used NOVA as a way to define what food should be purchased to be offered to children. In France, the National Health Plan in France used it for the first time Nova adopting as a goal a reduction 20% minimum in the consumption of ultra-processed foods. And as you know, the PAHO nutrient profile model used Nova also as a framework. I'm approaching the end of my presentation, but before finishing, I want to say that Nova is being developed, it's being proven. Three developments important here. So one is the Nova now was in cell phone apps. So the Open Food Facts in France, there's Rotulando is another app in Brazil. By this, with the barcodes, consumers can classify the foods according to Nova. We developed it in the last few years, a score of ultra-processed food intake, which takes 2 or 3 minutes to be applied. And this has been used in our telephone behavior risk factor survey in Brazil and could be used in other countries. So we are now working with different countries to adapt this score to be used as a sort of monitoring system. And finally, most of these works I reported, they were collected before Nova was developed. But now in future dietary surveys, we can improve the way we collect data to classify according to Nova. And we just defined one, just created one of these softwares. We are using a cohort study using internet in Brazil, and we'll have news on this very soon. Well, I finish here. I thank your attention, and I'm ready for questions if you have. Thank you.